What happens when a music icon walks onto a morning show set expecting a friendly chat, and instead finds herself in the crosshairs of questions she never agreed to answer? Faith Hill's appearance on CBS Mornings was supposed to be a celebration, a chance to talk about her upcoming projects and reflect on her legendary career. But what started as warm banter quickly spiraled into one of the most uncomfortable confrontations ever aired on morning television. The tension was palpable, the exchanges grew sharper, and by the time it was over, Faith Hill had made a decision that would send shockwaves through the entertainment world. Before we get into what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about all of this. Now, let's dive into how a routine morning interview became anything but routine. The morning started off innocently enough. Faith Hill walked onto the CBS Mornings set with that signature smile, her presence lighting up the studio as it always does. She settled into her chair between Gayle King and Nate Burleson, exchanging pleasantries about the weather, the early call time, and how good it was to be back in New York. Gayle opened with a softball question about Faith's new music, something about creative inspiration and what it felt like to be back in the studio after so much time. Faith answered graciously, talking about rediscovering her voice, about the joy of creating without pressure, about how different this phase of her career felt compared to the whirlwind of her earlier years. The conversation flowed smoothly, just as everyone expected it would. Then Nate Burleson leaned forward, and the energy in the room shifted. He had that look, that specific expression that seasoned interview subjects recognize immediately, the one that says the easy questions are over. Nate smiled, but there was something calculated behind it, something that suggested he was about to steer this ship into choppier waters. He started by complimenting her career, praising her resilience in an industry that can be unforgiving to women, especially as they age. Faith nodded along, gracious as ever, probably thinking this was still safe territory. But then Nate pivoted, asking her about the challenges of maintaining relevance when the music industry had moved so far beyond the country sound that had defined her peak years. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Faith's smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. You could see her recalibrating, trying to figure out if this was a genuine question or something else entirely. She responded carefully, saying that relevance was a funny word, that she had never chased trends, that her connection with her audience had always been about authenticity rather than chart positions. It was a diplomatic answer, the kind of response that should have allowed the conversation to move forward. But Nate did not move forward. Instead, he doubled down, asking if she ever worried that younger artists were not just taking her place, but making her style of music feel outdated, almost like a relic of a different era. Faith's posture changed. She sat up straighter, her hands folding together in her lap in that deliberate way people do when they are working very hard to stay composed. She looked at Nate directly, and when she spoke, her voice had lost some of its earlier warmth. She told him that she did not think of her music as outdated, that calling something a relic suggested it had no value anymore, and that millions of people still connected deeply with the songs she had created. She pointed out that legacy and relevance were not mutually exclusive, that some of the most celebrated artists in history were people who had stayed true to their vision rather than chasing whatever was momentarily popular. It was a strong response, assertive without being hostile, but you could feel the temperature in the studio rising. Gayle King jumped in, clearly sensing that things were getting tense, trying to smooth things over by redirecting to Faith's family, her marriage, the balance of personal life and career. Faith seemed grateful for the reprieve, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she talked about her husband, about their kids, about the ranch and the simple pleasures of life away from the spotlight. For a moment, it seemed like the interview had found its footing again, like they had successfully navigated past that awkward moment and could finish on a positive note. But Nate was not done. He waited until Faith had finished talking about her family, let the moment breathe for just a beat. And then he came back with another question that made everyone in the studio tense up all over again. He asked her about the rumors, the ones that had circulated for years, about tensions in her marriage, about whether the public image of the perfect country couple matched the private reality. He framed it as curiosity, saying that people admired her relationship and wanted to know how she and her husband had made it work for so long in an industry where marriages seemed to crumble constantly. But the framing did not soften the invasiveness of the question. Faith's eyes narrowed. She did not answer right away, instead letting the silence hang there for a moment, a silence that felt deliberate and pointed. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but unmistakably firm. She told Nate that her marriage was not a rumor to be dissected on morning television, that what she and her husband shared was private, and that she had never made her personal life a commodity for public consumption. Nate tried to backtrack, saying he meant no disrespect, that he was just acknowledging how much people admired her relationship. But Faith cut him off, not rudely, but decisively. She said that admiration did not entitle anyone to details, that respect meant understanding boundaries, and that she had come on the show to talk about her work, not to be interrogated about her private life. Gail tried to interject again, her tone soothing, suggesting they move on to talk about Faith's upcoming projects. But the damage was done. The atmosphere had shifted from uncomfortable to outright hostile, and Faith was no longer hiding her frustration. Nate, whether out of stubbornness or a belief that he was doing hard-hitting journalism, pressed forward. He brought up a recent interview where another artist had criticized the older generation of country musicians for not being supportive of new voices, for gatekeeping the industry in ways that made it harder for diverse artists to break through. He asked Faith directly if she thought there was any truth to that criticism, if she had ever reflected on her own role in an industry that had been slow to embrace change. It was a loaded question, one that accused her of complicity in systemic problems, without actually stating it outright. Faith stared at him, and for a moment, it seemed like she might stand up and walk off the set right then and there. Instead, she answered. She told Nate that she found it interesting that he was so eager to talk about gatekeeping and barriers, considering he was currently using his platform to put her on the defensive rather than celebrating her contributions. She said that if he wanted to have a real conversation about the challenges facing the music industry, they could do that, but ambushing a guest with accusations disguised as questions was not journalism. It was a performance. She pointed out that she had spent her entire career supporting other artists, mentoring younger singers, and using her influence to open doors wherever she could. She said that reducing her legacy to a debate about whether she had done enough was not just unfair, it was disrespectful. Gail looked stricken, clearly mortified by how far off the rails this had gone. Nate, for his part, seemed caught between doubling down and backing off, his expression flickering between defiance and something that might have been regret. Faith did not wait for him to decide. She stood up, calmly removed her microphone, and placed it on the table in front of her. She thanked Gail for the invitation, said she appreciated the opportunity, but that she would not sit there and be treated like a target. She told Nate that if he wanted to ask tough questions, he should make sure they were actually fair. And then she walked off the set. The cameras kept rolling for a few seconds, capturing the stunned faces of the remaining hosts, the awkward silence that no one seemed to know how to fill. Gail called for a commercial break, her voice tight, and the feed cut away. But the damage was done, and within minutes, clips of the confrontation were circulating online. Everyone weighing in on what had just happened, on who was in the wrong, on whether Faith had overreacted or if Nate had crossed a line. The debate was instant and intense, and it became clear very quickly that this was not just going to blow over. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Faith Hill had removed herself from the set, but she had not left the building, not yet. She was in one of the green rooms, surrounded by her team, her publicist already on the phone doing damage control, her manager pacing back and forth trying to figure out how to spin what had just happened. Faith herself sat quietly, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She was not the type to make impulsive decisions, and even though she had walked off that set, she was clearly processing everything that had just occurred, weighing her options, considering what came next. Meanwhile, back on set, the commercial break was ending, and Gail and Nate had to figure out how to return to the show and address what had just transpired in front of millions of viewers when they came back on air. Gail took the lead, her tone professional but noticeably strained. She acknowledged that the interview with Faith Hill had taken an unexpected turn, that things had gotten heated, and that Faith had decided to step away from the conversation. She did not assign blame, did not editorialize about who was right or wrong, but simply stated the facts as they had unfolded. Nate sat beside her, his expression more guarded now, less of the confident energy he had displayed earlier. When Gail turned to him, giving him the opportunity to address what had happened, he took a breath and spoke carefully. He said that he had asked questions he believed were fair. That as a journalist, his job was to have meaningful conversations that went beyond surface-level pleasantries. He said he respected Faith Hill immensely, that he had not intended to offend her, but that he stood by his questions. The response did not satisfy everyone watching. Social media was already ablaze with people taking sides, some defending Nate for asking tough questions, others accusing him of being disrespectful and ambushing a guest who had come on in good faith. The hashtag started trending almost immediately, people dissecting every word, every facial expression, every moment of the exchange. Some praised Faith for standing up for herself, for refusing to be treated like she owed anyone explanations about her personal life or her career choices. Others argued that she had been too sensitive, that if you are a public figure, you have to be prepared for difficult questions, that walking off a set was unprofessional regardless of how uncomfortable the conversation became. The debate was fierce, and it showed no signs of cooling down. Back in the green room, Faith was having her own internal debate. Her publicist was advising her to leave quietly, to let the dust settle, to release a statement later that was measured and carefully crafted. Her manager was more aggressive, suggesting they demand an apology from CBS, that they make it clear Faith had been blindsided and treated unfairly. But Faith was not interested in either of those approaches. She had spent decades in the public eye, had navigated countless interviews, had dealt with invasive questions and difficult journalists before. But something about this felt different. It was not just that Nate had asked tough questions, it was the way he had done it, the underlying tone that suggested he was more interested in creating a moment than in having a genuine conversation. And the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She made a decision. She told her team that she was not going to slink away quietly, that she was not going to issue some bland statement through a publicist that would get lost in the news cycle within a day. She wanted to go back out there, back onto that set, and say what needed to be said. Her publicist protested immediately, warning that going back could make things worse, that emotions were running high and it might be better to take time to cool off. But Faith was resolute. She said that she had walked off because she needed a moment to collect herself. But now that she had, she wanted to finish the conversation on her terms. Her team reluctantly agreed, and within minutes, arrangements were being made for Faith to return to the set. The producers were caught off guard. They had assumed Faith was gone for good, that they would have to spend the rest of the show managing the fallout and moving on to other segments. But when word came that Faith wanted to come back, that she wanted to address what had happened on air, there was a scramble to accommodate her. Gail was informed first, and she looked both relieved and apprehensive. Nate, when he heard, seemed less certain, his expression tightening. He had clearly thought the confrontation was over, that he would have time to regroup and prepare a more polished response. But Faith was not giving him that luxury. She was coming back, and she was coming back now. When Faith walked back onto the set, the energy was completely different from when she had first arrived. There was no warmth, no pleasantries, no pretense that this was just a friendly morning chat. She sat down across from Gail and Nate, her posture upright, her gaze steady. Gail welcomed her back, saying she appreciated Faith returning, that she knew the conversation had been difficult. Faith nodded, acknowledging Gail with a small, tight smile. But her attention was focused on Nate. She did not waste time with preamble. She looked at him directly and told him that she had come back because she wanted to make something very clear. Not just to him, but to everyone watching. She said that asking difficult questions was part of his job, and she respected that. But there was a difference between challenging someone and disrespecting them. She went through each of his questions methodically, breaking down why they had felt less like genuine inquiry and more like attempts to provoke. She addressed the question about relevance, pointing out that framing her career as potentially outdated was not a neutral question. It was a judgment disguised as curiosity. She talked about the marriage question, explaining that personal boundaries were not signs of evasiveness, they were signs of self-respect, and that no guest should be expected to defend their private life on national television. And she addressed the question about gatekeeping, the one that had ultimately pushed her to walk off. saying that accusing someone of complicity in industry problems without evidence or context was not journalism. It was a character attack. Nate listened, his jaw tight, his hands folded on the table in front of him. When Faith finished, there was a long pause. Gail looked between them, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out. Finally, Nate spoke. He said that he heard what Faith was saying, that he understood her perspective, but that he still believed the questions were fair. He said that public figures, especially ones as influential as Faith, should be able to handle scrutiny, that shying away from difficult topics did not serve the audience. He said that if she felt disrespected, that was not his intention, but that he could not apologize for doing his job the way he believed it should be done. Faith's expression did not change, but something in her eyes hardened. She told Nate that she was not asking him to apologize for doing his job. She was asking him to recognize that the way he had approached the interview had crossed a line. She said that scrutiny and respect were not mutually exclusive, that it was possible to ask hard questions without being condescending, without framing every topic as if the guest were on trial. She said that she had spent decades earning her place in the industry, that she had nothing to prove to him or anyone else, and that if this was the standard for interviews on CBS mornings, then she wanted no part of it. And then she said something that made everyone in the studio freeze. She said that she would not be returning, that this would be her last appearance on the show. Not just today, but indefinitely. Gail's face went pale. She tried to walk it back, saying that surely they could work this out. That one difficult interview should not end a relationship between Faith and the show. But Faith was unmoved. She said that it was not about one interview, it was about the principle. She said that she valued herself too much to put herself in situations where she was treated as if her presence were a privilege granted by the hosts rather than a mutual exchange of respect. She thanked Gail for always being professional, for trying to keep the conversation balanced, but she made it clear that as long as the show operated the way it did, she would not be coming back. The finality in her voice left no room for negotiation. Nate, for the first time, looked genuinely rattled. He started to say something, perhaps another defense of his approach, but Faith held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. She told him that she was done with the conversation, that she had said what she needed to say, and that nothing he added would change her decision. She stood up again, this time with a sense of closure rather than frustration. She shook Gail's hand, wished her well, and then walked off the set for the second time that morning. But this time, there was no ambiguity. She was not coming back. The interview was over. And so was her relationship with CBS Mornings. The camera lingered on Gail and Nate for a moment, capturing their reactions. Gail looked devastated, clearly aware of the magnitude of what had just happened. Nate looked defensive, his expression somewhere between defiant and uncertain. The show went to another commercial break, but the damage was done. Faith Hill had not just walked off a set, she had made a public stand, drawing a line in the sand about how she expected to be treated. And that decision, broadcast live to millions, would dominate the conversation for days, maybe weeks to come. The fallout was immediate and unavoidable. Within an hour of Faith Hill's second departure from the CBS Mornings set, every major entertainment outlet was running the story. The clips had been shared thousands of times, dissected frame by frame, analyzed by body language experts and media commentators who all had opinions about what had transpired. The narrative split almost immediately down the middle. On one side were those who saw Faith as a victim of aggressive journalism, someone who had been ambushed and disrespected when she had shown up, expecting a straightforward promotional interview. On the other side were those who believed Nate had simply been doing his job, asking the kinds of probing questions that separate real journalism from puff pieces designed to make celebrities feel comfortable. The middle ground was vanishingly small, and everyone seemed determined to plant their flag on one side or the other. CBS was in crisis mode. Executives who had been in meetings or on calls that morning suddenly found themselves dealing with a public relations disaster that was spiraling out of control. The network released a brief statement saying they respected Faith Hill, valued her contributions to music and culture, and regretted that the interview had not gone as planned. It was a carefully worded Nan statement that managed to avoid assigning blame while also failing to satisfy anyone. Faith's supporters saw it as corporate cowardice, a refusal to hold Nate accountable for what they viewed as unacceptable behavior. Nate's defenders saw it as the network, throwing him under the bus, sacrificing a journalist for doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The statement pleased no one, which meant it probably succeeded in its goal of keeping CBS from being pinned down to any particular position. Nate himself was dealing with his own reckoning. His social media accounts were flooded with comments, some supportive, many vitriolic. People accused him of being a bully, of targeting a woman in a way he never would have targeted a male guest, of using his platform to tear down someone who had built a legendary career. Others rushed to his defense, arguing that Faith had been overly sensitive, that she had weaponized her hurt feelings to avoid answering legitimate questions, that walking off a set twice was the real display of unprofessionalism. A response later that afternoon, a carefully composed paragraph that reiterated his respect for Faith, acknowledged that the interview had been difficult, but maintained that asking challenging questions was part of his responsibility to the audience. He said he wished things had gone differently, but he stopped short of apologizing for his approach. Faith, meanwhile, had left the CBS building and returned to her hotel. She did not release a statement through her publicist, did not post anything on social media, did not do any of the things people expected her to do. Instead, she stayed quiet, letting the conversation unfold without her direct participation. It was a strategic silence, one that allowed her actions to speak louder than any carefully crafted words could. People filled the void with their own interpretations, projecting their experiences and frustrations onto what had happened. Women who had felt dismissed or interrogated in professional settings saw themselves in Faith's response. People who valued directness and accountability saw themselves in Nate's questioning. The incident became a mirror, reflecting back whatever people brought to it. Back at CBS, the internal discussions were intense. There were debates about whether Nate had crossed a line, whether producers should have intervened sooner, whether the questions had been cleared in advance, or if Nate had gone rogue. Some staffers defended him passionately, saying that morning shows had become too soft, too willing to let celebrities control the narrative, and that Nate had been trying to elevate the conversation. Others argued that there was a way to ask difficult questions without alienating guests, that the goal should be insightful dialogue rather than confrontation for its own sake. Gayle King found herself in the middle of it all, trying to maintain her professionalism while also processing her own feelings about what had happened. She had worked hard to build relationships with guests, to create an environment where people felt comfortable opening up, and she worried that this incident would damage the show's reputation and make future bookings more difficult. The broader conversation expanded beyond just what had happened in that studio. People started talking about the culture of morning television, about the pressure to create viral moments, about the blurred lines between entertainment and journalism. Some argued that Nate had been trying to bring a harder edge to a format that had grown stale, that audiences were tired of watching celebrities get softballs lobbed at them while promoting their latest projects. Others countered that there was value in the traditional morning show format, that not every interview needed to be a confrontation, that there was skill in making guests feel comfortable enough to reveal something genuine without feeling attacked. The debate touched on larger questions about media, about respect, about power dynamics between interviewers and subjects. Faith's team was monitoring everything closely. They watched the narrative shift and evolve, saw the way different outlets framed the story, noted which commentators defended her and which ones criticized her decision to walk off. But Faith herself remained firm in her choice. She told her team that she did not regret what she had done, that she would make the same decision again, that there were some lines she would not allow to be crossed, regardless of the professional consequences. Her team worried about potential backlash, about whether this would affect future opportunities, about whether other shows might be hesitant to book her if they thought she might walk off their sets too. But Faith was unconcerned. She said that any show worth appearing on would understand why she had done what she did, and any show that sided with the approach Nate had taken was not a show she wanted to be part of anyway. The turning point came when other artists started speaking out. A few country music stars posted supportive messages praising Faith for standing up for herself, for refusing to be diminished or interrogated on live television. Some talked about their own experiences with interviews that had gone sideways, moments where they had felt ambushed or disrespected, but had stayed silent because walking off seemed too risky. Faith's willingness to draw that line gave others permission to acknowledge that they had felt similarly in their own careers. It became less about one specific incident and more about a broader conversation about how artists, particularly women, were treated in media spaces. The support from her peers bolstered Faith's position, making it harder to dismiss her actions as an overreaction or a diva moment. Nate, watching this unfold, found himself increasingly isolated. Some of his colleagues at CBS stood by him publicly, but privately there were whispers that he had misread the room, that he had pushed too hard, too fast, that his desire to be seen as a serious journalist had led him to mistake aggression for insight. He started doing interviews himself, appearing on other shows to defend his approach, to explain his thinking, to push back against the narrative that he had been out of line. But each appearance seemed to generate more controversy rather than less. People parsed his words, looked for signs of defensiveness or ego, debated whether he was genuinely reflecting or just doubling down. The more he talked, the more polarized the conversation became. Weeks passed, and the story refused to die. It became a case study in journalism schools, a topic of discussion on media criticism podcasts, a reference point in broader debates about celebrity culture and the role of the press. Faith Hill never returned to CBS Mornings, staying true to her word. She continued her career, did interviews with other outlets, appeared on shows where she felt respected and valued. The incident did not define her, but it became part of her story. A moment where she had chosen dignity over convenience, where she had walked away rather than tolerate treatment she found unacceptable. For Nate, the incident remained a shadow over his work. He continued hosting, continued asking tough questions, but there was always an undercurrent of debate about whether he had learned anything from what happened with Faith, whether he had adjusted his approach or simply become more careful about which guests he pressed hardest. The real legacy of that morning was not about who was right or wrong. It was about the conversation it sparked, about the questions it raised that had no easy answers. When does challenging journalism cross into disrespect? Where is the line? Between holding public figures accountable and ambushing them with loaded questions, how much control should a guest have over the direction of an interview, and how much responsibility does a journalist have to pursue uncomfortable truths? Questions did not have universal answers, and different people would always land in different places depending on their values and experiences. But the fact that the conversation was happening at all, that people were grappling with these issues in real time, meant that something significant had occurred that morning in the CBS studio. So, what do you think? Was Faith Hill right to walk off the CBS Mornings set, or should she have stayed and finished the interview? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you hit that subscribe button so you do not miss any of our future videos. We will see you in the next one.